Okay, this week I'm very happy to introduce you to someone that was introduced to me by my friend Matthew Davidson. His name is Jean-Luc Cohen-Sinclair, who works as an instructor at Breklee with Matthew, but also has a fantastic and very interesting kind of area of interest. And so I'm anxious to share that with you. And let's say hi to Jean-Luc. Jean-Luc, hi, how are you this morning?
I'm great. Thank you, Darwin.
Thank you very much for taking the time to talk with us. Why don't we kick it off by having you tell people a little bit about the work that you do?
Sure, I'll be happy to. Well, currently I'm focusing on an area which relates to gaming, but also goes beyond audio for games, which is procedural audio, procedural sound design, which is still somewhat nascent, I think, in as an art form, and that, as the name implies, is really the art of creating sounds by through the use of mathematical models, and creating sound objects which can actually be used in many ways to create, hopefully, realistic sound effects, but also entirely new sounds with applications for music and composition too.
You have got a pretty interesting. You have a pretty interesting history with sound design. You've actually done some work in the video game world to this point, right?
Yes. These past few years, I've started to do more, work more as a consultant. I was working with video games when I was still in undergrad at Breklee, and initially I was doing a lot of sort of translations or localization from English to French, and that sort of led me into an area that was really fascinating to me because I grew up with video games. You know, I had an Atari 2600 console as a kid that I probably spent more time than with any of my friends. So I was very early on, into games. So when I was able to realize that, well, there's something that can be done using both of these passions of mine, that was pretty exciting.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, why don't we do, generally in my podcast, one of the things I like to do is to talk to people and have them give us a little hint of their background and how they became the artists that they are. I'm curious about how you kind of pull these things together. So why don't you do that? Why don't you tell us what's your background and how did you get to be the guy you are today?
Sure. So I think that it really goes way back to my first video game console, which I must have gotten when I was maybe 6 years old. I was pretty early on in the gaming world, and that was, you know, the moment I got that, my life sort of changed forever, and I spent many hours in front of it, going to arcades as well. And as soon as I grew a little bit older, maybe around 10 or 11, when I started to be a bit more curious, I got into computer programming, and that was really, really fascinating to me. I started to learn, teaching myself some BASIC and some other, Pascal and these old languages. Well, at the same time, my mother was insistent that I would learn music, and I had no interest whatsoever in becoming a musician. But eventually, I relented and gave in. I cave in under pressure, and it turns out that I really loved it. She wanted me to play the piano, and actually, I wanted to play the organ because early I really liked the music of Bach, and I felt that, you know, I could do that. I could learn to play that and be pretty happy. And so after about maybe a year or two, I started to tinker more with sound and computers very, very simply at first. Just kind of making little melodies or modifying little melodies on what was my Amstrad computer, which was a British-made computer,
Right.
which was somewhere popular in Europe. And I really kind of for a while moved away from computer programming as a whole, because I also realized that I could use computers to actually record music. Because I started to get more and more into not just learning how to play the organ, but the idea of working with sequencers and MIDI. So I eventually traded my old computer for an Atari, a 1040, but Cubase 1.0, and a MIDI keyboard. And then I probably just didn't leave my bedroom unless it was to go to class for the next 3 years, just sequencing music as much as I could. So that was one of the ways that these tools came together for me. And I even kind of gave up gaming at that point because there was only so many hours in the day.
Right.
But deciding that having made a decision that I wanted to study music beyond what I was doing at the conservatory in my hometown, which is right outside of Paris, I applied to Breklee, and I think I enrolled there in 1993. Spent the first 2 years just going through the same program pretty much as everybody does, and until I took the C-Song class with Dr. Boulanger, who remains one of my mentors to this day, and that sort of brought me right back to this idea of computer programming, which I really enjoyed, and brought in the synthesis dimension. And being able to generate sounds purely from synthesis was really exciting to me.
Right.
And at the same time, I started to get freelance work for a company that was in Boston called Looking Glass Technologies, which is no longer around, to do some work on games. And at that point, sort of like the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. That sort of gave me a good sense of the direction I wanted to take from that point on. After that, I got a master's at CalArts in composition, and I really spent a lot of time, way more time at that point, focusing on programming and synthesis. And I was really lucky because at the time I was able to study with Boris Subotnick, with Tom Erb, some really fantastic people.
Right.
And so that was a really sort of golden opportunity. And while I was doing that, I was doing a lot of work for multimedia, anywhere from doing programming for online games to authoring DVD audios and video discs. So that was sort of what I was doing until the point I graduated, when I started to do more sound design, so post-production work. And one day I actually got a call from a friend of mine asking me if I wouldn't mind sending him a CD for this job, this gig really, that he had heard of, but he couldn't tell me who it was for. And long story longer, hopefully not. Well, long story short, it was for Trent Reznor, who was looking for help doing Doom 3. He was prototyping the sounds for Doom 3 at the time.
I see.
And because I had a background both in sound design and sort of computer science and video games, that sort of worked out pretty well. It very naturally fell into place. And that was obviously very exciting, and I loved the Doom franchise. I was a big fan of his work, of Trent Reznor's work.
Right.
And I remember very vividly while doing the sound design for the first level of the game that one of the rooms in which you walked in had this barrel, because all video games must have barrels in them. But I think it's an unwritten law. But this one was special, and it was special because it actually had physics properties built into it, meaning that you could push it down a flight of stairs and it would fall down differently every time.
Okay.
And that made me stop for a minute, because up until that point, the work that you would do traditionally for sound design in games was fairly predictable. I mean, sure, there was an interactive element there, but while you could never quite predict how and when the sounds would be triggered, they would usually sound the same way every time, or with slight variation in the few tricks that we would use to make them less repetitive.
Right.
This was the first time that I sort of became aware of the fact that there was a major disconnect between the way where, or I should say, the place the technology was when it came to visuals and when it came to audio and gaming and beyond. Meaning that we could now create virtual environments that behave fairly realistically, and that we're starting to, but we were still playing back samples, essentially just static photographs of sound that we were layering underneath. And while we did find a way to make it work, it was a workaround that was very obvious to me. And
sure.
Having a background in C sound and in programming, I guess the seed was planted there. Then that there was an area of research there that had been largely left untouched until that point. And so that's one of, you could say, I guess, the experience that really triggered this interest or sparked that interest in me.
Sure. Well, that's really an interesting trail, but it also leaves me with about 10,000 questions here. So I'm going to kind of launch into a few of them. Let's reel all the way back, first of all, to you getting started with, you said it was an Amstrad computer first?
Correct. Actually, my very, very first was technically a Sinclair ZX81.
Right, yeah, which was my first one as well, actually.
Yep. You know exactly what I'm talking about then.
Yeah, I do. And wasn't the Amstrad kind of like the super version of the Sinclair, or was it somehow I have those two like linked in my head in some way?
I think a lot of these computer companies actually went back and forth, and the designs were fairly similar. But yes, the Amstrad was the sort of gaming version of it. It came a few years later, and that was really geared more toward gaming.
Right. Okay. So, all right. From there, you went to the Atari 1040, and I have to say that I'm pretty fascinated. I did not have an Atari. That was at a time when my vision was focused in a different direction. But I'm amazed at the number of people, the number of people in the music community who got their start with the 1040, and particularly with the 1040 and Cubase 1, much the way that you stated. Now, my question is, given that you were coming from a background where computers were mostly gaming devices, to what extent was the fact that Cubase kind of felt like a game version of making music that had something to do with you developing a fascination with it? Because I felt like those early sequencers, when I first interacted with the computer sequencer, I was fascinated because it did sort of feel like a game and sort of felt like you were trying to solve puzzles, how to get from this key change to that key change and stuff like that.
Oh, absolutely. I think you're spot on there. It very much felt like a game. So it was a gaming environment. That's pretty much what I had done with computers for the most part. Even to some extent, when I was programming, it was still for fun.
Sure.
And it felt, it was very interactive, obviously. There was a lot of features which were, again, as you pointed out, almost like solving a puzzle. There was an element of it which had to do with MIDI, which was new and exciting as well. And there was an element of it which had to do with troubleshooting and learning these new technologies. So it was a very playful way to get into music technology. And it's kind of remained that way to a large extent for me, which is probably why I'm still doing it.
Yeah, you're right. It's a playful way of almost sneaking into the process of composition, and also one of helping people engage in music in a way other than their mom yelling at them to go practice piano after dinner, right? Now, I find it interesting that your gaze moved to the organ. And what kind of organ was it that you were using?
Well, at home I had one of these early Yamaha Electones,
Okay.
organ. So it was an electronic organ to practice on. There was a small pipe organ that we had access to once in a while at the conservatory, and it was actually more of a elaborate harmonium, like one of these. But I think that the reason that was important to me was because of the music I was attracted to, which was Bach. I also enjoyed the sound of it very much, and that was, to me, more interesting than the piano for some reason.
Right. That's what I wanted to ask about. In the organ, to me, was one of the first instruments that you could actually do sort of elementary sound design on. Right. So my start was with a church organ, but a drawbar Hammond organ. Right. But later on, we got, at the church, they also got, a typical Lowry organ with all the different flutes and clarinets and stuff like that. But even in that case, you had the ability, first of all, to play around with the contours of the sound using the volume pedals. And you could also mix the sounds in sort of unique ways. And I found it was one of those things that really caught my ear as an interesting way to approach sound. To what extent did the organ do that for you, or how did that end up being sort of an introduction into synthesis for you?
It absolutely was. In a way, you could say that I sort of learned music and synthesis at the same time, in parallel. Because the experience of learning music was very early on associated with some element of sound design, some way of manipulating the sound, of mixing different sounds together. So that was, in retrospect, of course, it's something that seems quite a little obvious now, but at the time I had no idea that there was other ways to learn about music. But it seemed like there was yet another level of interest to me. I liked making these different sounds, and also liked having another level of creative freedom.
Sure.
In deciding what the sound would be like for that particular piece or this particular piece. So it was very much an element that led me into sound design early on.
And so then your travels take you to Breklee, and the person who, another one of these like central characters in so many of the people I talk to, is the amazing Dr. B. I badly want to get an interview with him because I would say fully half of the people that I've interviewed to this point have, in one way or another, say, well, Dr. B did this for me. He's an amazingly influential person. And his introduction of C sound to you sounds like it was sort of the place where programming and music really coalesced for you.
Yes, absolutely. And yes, Dr. B is definitely an amazing and central character to our community, and I'm not surprised that so many people mention him in your interviews. Having been introduced to C sound, I again was really the time where let me just back up a little bit. I always felt somewhat frustrated when I was at the organ that I could never play something between, say, a C and a C sharp.
Oh, yes.
That was one of my frustrations. I loved that I could change the sound, but I felt that there was something there which I knew I wanted to access, and I didn't have access to. So when I took Dr. B's C sound class, it was a way for me to sort of reconcile my love of programming and music and synthesis. But B, it also gave me complete freedom over what was going to be played when. Of course, it required quite a bit of work initially, and we're still talking about a time which did require some rendering time for some basic stuff. In fact, I remember getting basic cable by place because it would take 7 hours to render a piece on, and
so you had to have something to do.
Yeah, exactly. Because I had nothing else to do. Well, I'm sure I had other things to do, but as far as forms of entertainment, things were severely limited because some of the pieces would take 7 hours to render, and So that was the impetus for me of getting basic cable, but that really was pretty wild in terms of all the possibilities that it opened up all of a sudden. And for a while, the only way that I related to music was through code for at least a couple of years, and that was something that an experience that I could not. I can't emphasize enough how crucial that was to making me want to pursue that field.
Now, how did that, or what other classes maybe that you took, how did those things set you up for the sound design work that you ended up doing with your consulting work and eventually with on the Doom 3 project? What were the things that were sort of like essential tools to get you there?
There was a class by Neil Leonard, which was his multimedia class, which was also pretty central in terms of giving me tools that I could use to bring in different mediums together. And at the time we would learn Director and Premiere to do basic interactive programming and video manipulation. So those two classes gave me a lot of tools in terms of being able to pursue what would turn out to be a career after Breklee, and certainly gave me a direction also for graduate work that I wanted to pursue. I sort of felt like I left Breklee, and maybe most people feel that way in terms of getting your undergrad. I sort of felt like I was done with my undergrad, but I had more questions than answers.
Yeah, that actually does seem like a common thing, especially for people coming out of Breklee. And I've had the pleasure of speaking to a number of people who got their undergrad education at Breklee. Certainly Matthew, but also like Keith Fullerton Whitman and some other folks. And unlike a lot of schools, there seems to be something about Breklee, first of all, that helps people find work, which is a pretty significant deal, right? But also there's something about it that where everybody says it was hard, it was incredibly hard, but I came out of there hungrier than when I went in, which is actually kind of an interesting twist, because so often people come out of their undergrad never wanting to think about that area of study again.
That's a very good point. In fact, I would say both these points to me have been very true. I think Breklee does do a very good job, actually, of setting people up for a career, much more so than some of the other schools I've either taught at or dealt with. But I think that it also creates more questions than answers. Not because the education there is not fantastic, just because it is, I think, in a way, so great that you just don't want the experience to stop. And you often, and I certainly felt that way, obviously, you leave realizing that there's far more to this particular topic, whatever your field of interest is, than you even suspected initially.
Right. It's interesting because I think that music, and particularly music technology, is one of those things that from the outside looks like a rather small area of interest, but it's one of those areas where the deeper you get in, the more details you see. Recently, for a class that I was teaching, I introduced them to the little documentary about, you can find it online. It's about Curtis Rhodes and his kind of perspective on his own personal journey into granular synthesis. And, I talked to the class afterwards, and they were like amazed that, here was a little subgenre of a subgenre of a subset of music technology. And here was this guy who was able to dedicate his life to it. And it really opened up their eyes to how deep you could get into this stuff, right?
Absolutely.
It seems like that's one of the things that Breklee does, is it opens the door for people to start considering that, the fact that there's a lot more depth that's available.
Absolutely, and especially in I think you're right. Specifically in music technology, there are so many potential areas of studies that have still been, for some of them, not quite fully explored, to say the least. That is, I think, a great way for somebody who actually has an interest in subject in the first place to realize the full potential that there is to dedicating one's life journey to one particular area, or at least to dedicate a very large portion of time to an area which they may not have even been aware of before entering the program. Curtis Wood is obviously a fantastic example of that, and so pivotal in the work that he's been able to do. But in a way, that's as you know, that's one of the many examples, and that's something that I'm very grateful for. I would also think that it is still an area which lends itself to research, as you know, and that in itself sometimes is exciting. The fact that it is in fact still a research-heavy area, which has very practical applications, but is constantly evolving, I think, as and holds appeal in itself.
Right. So you talked about the idea of procedural sound design, and particularly the way that this barrel in Doom sort of like opened your head to a new way of thinking about sound design, which I think is actually an apt description, because first of all of us can visualize exactly what you're talking about. Even if we haven't worked on Doom 3, and I'm afraid I probably spent too much of my life on that thing. But even without that, everybody's kind of seen that kind of activity, and the fact that now these physics engines are making it so that the visual aspects of video gaming and visual display make things non-direct or indirect. We don't control every bounce and every movement of the barrel as it goes down the stairs. And so that does bring us to talking about the idea of procedural sound design. Where are people even talking about this stuff? I think the only thing that I've actually run across that is like a book about the subject, and I'm trying to remember the name of it. I think it's called The Nature of Code, or something like that.
Yes, I believe so, actually. Because there actually are some resources available now. Not very many, honestly, still. I mean, we're in 2015, and you would think, I would have thought anyway, that there would be a lot more by now. There is a fantastic book called Designing Sound by Andy Farnell.
Yeah, by Farnell. That's right. I forgot about that book. Yes. I actually even have that on my shelf. I can't believe I didn't think of that right away, too.
That is a fantastic book, and it still is, I think, the only systematic study of sound design and procedural audio that I've found out there that is so comprehensive and from such a practical standpoint as well. And there's definitely some other research that's been going on in the field, directly or indirectly. Terry Cook did quite a bit of work in that area too. I think in the 90s he was already talking about possibility of generating sound like footsteps using granular synthesis.
Right.
There's Nicolas Fournel, who works for Sony Europe, for many years been trying to preach the idea and doing some research on the topic of procedural audio. However, you're correct. There aren't very many resources available on the subject. And most of the interest that I've seen and the research definitely has come from academia. And I think there's a number of reasons besides the inherent nature of academia being a place that will concentrate research. Part of it is that there is a resistance, for a better word, coming from the gaming community, but not only, to this concept of procedural audio. And I think that has to do with a bit of a catch-22, which is, well, there is, first of all, the fact that it's a new way of relating to sound design.
Right.
One which, certainly in traditional post-production environments, is completely foreign. Which is not to say that there is not an art form, of course, to doing sound design in this way. I mean, we all know that doing sound for film is an art form that can take a lifetime to master.
Right.
But we are talking still about layering samples together. In a way, I relate to it more as a music concrete approach, which is sound collage and mixing sounds together. And if you really think about it, the techniques that were outlined by the pioneers of music concrete are still more or less the techniques that we use, albeit a lot more developed with obviously much, much better tools. But these are still the same techniques essentially that we use to create sound for film, for TV, and so forth. In gaming, which you would think would be a much more, open world to changes in technology and technological advancement, that actually has a very, very difficult time making its way into the workflow. Because, a lot of the people that came into gaming initially come from traditional post-production environment. So there wasn't necessarily like this way of thinking that was part of their training. Also because there is a bit of a misconception or this sort of catch-22, which is, the problem with procedural audio is that it's very promising, but it doesn't sound that great, which is not actually necessarily true. We have now some very convincing models of sounds, which are extremely helpful. I teach a class on procedural audio at Breklee. I taught the first prototype of it last year, and I had students make all the sounds to a 32-second to minute-long video using procedural sound design, and I was surprised at how well some of the work came out.
Okay.
They kind of blew my mind for some of them. But, this idea that, procedural sound design doesn't sound that great, so, maybe it's not worth spending our time, to me, it's a little bit like saying in 1906, cars are great, but horses are so much faster and so much more reliable that what's the point in developing cars?
That's a great way to twist it. I love it. Yeah.
So, I definitely see or understand why there has been this reluctance for a greater push toward procedural audio. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I think we're doing ourselves a disservice. And when you compare how far we've gone on the visual and physics side of things, and how many of these advances have happened in the past 20 years, exponentially, for that matter. And audio hasn't quite kept up.
Now, to what extent do you think, though, that some of that has to do with the game community and particularly the business of gaming? So I've had some experience in working with gaming companies, and there have been a couple of things that actually sort of hampered interacting or engaging the sound design like I wanted to do with what they were doing. And it was particularly related to a few things. First of all, a lot of times with procedural sound work, it's very difficult to say, here's the exact amount of CPU I'm going to use when generating this sound. That's something that the game people can't handle because they have sort of like this way they think of game performance as being a budget. They budget a certain amount of CPU or GPU access for the visuals and another certain percent for the AI and another percent, and then, a very tiny percent for the sound, which is kind of funny because to me, and maybe it's because I'm focused on the sound side of things, to me, sound is a critical part of making an environment seem real.
Absolutely.
But it seems like they don't budget very much time or money for that part of reality.
Absolutely. You're 100% correct. So I also teach at NYU where I do some of the gaming courses there in the music tech department. And one of the things that we've been doing is, grab a game which is, small to medium size games, so like casual gaming terms type, and replacing all of the sound, but also increasing or improving, I should say, the implementation, how the sounds are triggered, when they're triggered, and so forth.
Okay.
And the difference in how engaging the gameplay is night and day.
Sure.
To us, sound people, I think it's an obvious, it's a given that sound will make your environment believable and more engaging. But you're absolutely correct. I find that to this day there are companies that don't really see the point in investing a lot in audio, and that has been an issue. When you're mentioning the topic of CPU power and this budgeting idea, which is very much how the gaming community relates to CPU power. That's another issue, which I would argue is becoming less so of an issue these days, depending on what you're trying to do. And by that, I mean some models can be very, very taxing on a CPU. That's obvious. However, there are instances where we can severely alleviate the amount of RAM that is being used for certain types of sound. And the most obvious is natural/weather sounds, wind, rain. Those can actually take quite a bit of RAM to create a decent sounding environment that's not going to be completely repetitive. But these are also very easy to do now with very good models that require very, very little CPU power. And we have started to see these as plugins into some of the software used for sound for games. But I think that's just the tip of the iceberg. And I think even if, and we should be concerned with the issue of CPU usage, we could still create far more models for convincing sounds than we have, if only a little bit more research or efforts was put into it.
Right.
And of course, we need to keep improving the existing ones, both in terms of performance and realism. That's another given. There's one more issue that I think is worth mentioning, which is that there are a lot of programmers who are excellent programmers. There are a lot of excellent audio designers, sound designers, audio engineers. There are few who are able to bridge these two worlds, in my experience. And I think that's also been part of the issue. That is, I think that we have a shortage of programmers that have a good understanding and grasp on audio right now. And that skill set, I think, is increasingly valuable in terms of something that a student, undergrad or grad student can actually focus in.
Sure.
And I very often, even more so now that I tend to do a little bit more consulting, I find myself bridging the gap between the audio department and the team of programmers that's working on a project. In a way, it's almost like somebody has to translate between the two. And then things can really move forward.
Right. I think it's interesting because from one perspective, it seems like that shouldn't be happening anymore. The whole creative coding movement has sort of put a lot of coding resources in the hands of artists and sound designers and musicians. And so there's this sense of, hey, we're all coders, except the kind of coding that a person who's doing, OpenGL frameworks versus the person who's doing AI development versus the person who's trying to wrap it all together in a big executable. It's a very different kind of programming than somebody who's using processing or C-Sound or Max to make a little bit of sound producing code. So I think that there still is kind of a disconnect and certainly is a position for someone who can kind of be a translator between those sets of people.
Absolutely. And you're right in pointing out that there is still more and more people as artists are coders, which I think is wonderful. But as we both know, to be a great programmer is a lifelong pursuit in itself.
Right.
And so I think that that's always going to be the case. However, by being able to educate both the programmers and the artists a little bit more in each other's work, and by being able to interest programmers more in creative applications, and likewise artists in understanding more some of the technical aspects of their work, I think things become a lot more interesting, because in your own work you've pointed out that at times you felt limited as a sound designer by what was available in
Right.
terms of the technologies that you were working with.
Right.
And I think that we've all experienced that. And so it sounds to me, based on my experience, that a sound designer who's starting his or her career today will be expected to bridge that gap. That will be part of becoming a successful sound designer, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree. I'm curious about how things are going to diverge, because we certainly see that within the programming communities that there are massive changes to sort of like the specialization that people get into, where it seems like in a lot of the art stuff, there's getting to be more of a generalization, which is that you're kind of expected to know a lot about a lot of areas of art. It used to be that, if you were a painter, you never picked up a pencil. If you were a sculptor, you would never look at photography, right? That was the way that art was treated. And similarly with music, if you were a classical musician, you would never look at jazz. If you were a jazz player, you would never consider doing anything in electronic music or whatever. There were very much these silos of activity, and it seems like that's being forced to break down. And some of it is because of the desire to have, for artists to develop their own audience and to do so in a way that's kind of populist, but also because the way that artists make a living is very different from the way it used to be. It used to be that you would be an artist and you would either be blessed by an academic institution to become an instructor, or you would be blessed by a patron to be an artist that was subsidized, right?
Absolutely.
Now it's like art seems to be much more a part of generalized society. We play a game, and gaming is especially an area with massive amounts of media artwork embedded into it. There's this sense that this is a new area of artwork that represents, I hate to say a career because it's always weird to enmesh the idea of being an artist with the idea of having a career. There's something about that seems like a mismatch. But it does seems to be starting to be the case, which you can imagine there being careers that are artistic at its very nature, right?
Yes, absolutely.
How do you see that expanding in the future? How is that going to blossom, or maybe is that going to? Do you think it might contract? Do you think it's a real future for arts and particularly students studying art?
I do think it's going to continue to blossom. I don't see the trend reverting or even slowing down. Although you're right, it is a novel concept in many ways. But because of the applications for the arts have become so much wider, and I think you're right that gaming is itself responsible for a large portion of that. And because those technologies are used increasingly not just for gaming, for that matter, but for anything from education to training. And I don't think that we're going to see less of that happening in the future, which is very exciting. It's a great time to be an artist. As far as, whether or not this is going to mean that, we're going to be turning out hundreds of thousands of artists that are going to easily find employment every year, I don't necessarily know that will be the fact. There will always be competition. There will always be the inherent challenge of being an artist, which is,
Right.
Finding one's voice. And however, I think it is true that this has become a new trend, which I think is exciting and definitely one that I foresee anyway from where I'm, from the places I teach and the students and clients I work with. I don't see that slowing down right now.
Yeah, right. There you go. So, it's time for us to wrap up. I really appreciate you spending the time. This has been a really fascinating dive into your world. One question, though, that I would like to have, and I'm going to start asking this more of people because I think it's a pretty fascinating question. I was asked this in a recent interview, and it really introduced an interesting discussion, which is, if you were to meet an 18-year-old version of yourself, what is the advice you would give to that person to help them or have an easier or better path?
That is a great question. I would probably tell that person, or me as an 18-year-old, to make sure that the way that you present yourself as an artist is the way that you want to be seen as an artist. I think that there is a lot of time artists make compromises because we all have to pay the bills. And that means that it's very easy to get diverted in an area which is not one's main area of interest and to sort of get pigeonholed. So I think that presenting yourself as the artist that you want to become and be is maybe the most, or one of the most important things that you can do.
Wow, that's an awesome statement. Thank you for that, and thank you very much for the time. This is really wonderful, and hopefully people can interact with your some of your work online, but also to know that you're teaching both at Breklee and NYU. Hopefully students out there looking for a way to get an interesting twist on their education will be able to look up some of your classes as well.
I certainly hope so, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about procedural audio, because as you can tell, it's an area I feel quite strongly about.
Absolutely. Well, and what I'm hoping is that at some point in the near future we might be able to talk again and kind of dive even further into it, because it is not only is it an area of your interest and an area for potential growth, but it also really does seem to be, it's going to just get to be really important. So. But yeah, so thanks a lot for that, and we'll talk to you soon.
Bye.
Alas, the cold still continues. Nevertheless, a fascinating talk with Jean-Luc. I really appreciate the time that he was willing to take to talk with us, and the whole idea of procedural sound development is actually pretty exciting. A couple of details. First of all, thanks again for listening and for introducing other people. We got a really nice spike in numbers recently, so I appreciate that. I appreciate all the new listeners. It seems like we've got a bunch of new people that have come online recently. Really appreciate that. But mostly I want to ask you to continue to tell friends, family, enemies, everybody, that this exists. Help them find it, because the name I kind of goofed up, and so it's a little hard to find. But help them find the podcast and get a listen to it, get a listen to some of the back episodes. A lot of fascinating stuff out there. One other detail is next week is my annual week off for family vacation, and so I will not be doing anything on June the 21st. We will resume on June the 28th, and I'll see you then. Thanks a lot, and have a good week. Have a good 2 weeks.